Hey everyone, this is a piece by Max Shachtman titled The Bureaucratic Jungle, or at least that's how it's titled in The Fate of the Russian Revolution, Lost Texts of Critical Marxism, edited by Sean Matgamna. The footnote here says, this piece is abridged from New International, March 1945, quote, "From the bureaucratic jungle, the Socialist Workers' Party changes lines," end quote. Quote, "Morrison," end quote. Here is a pen name for Albert Goldman, who had gone into opposition within the Socialist Workers' Party. In 1946, he would leave the Socialist Workers' Party and be a member of the Workers' Party for 2 years before leaving at the same time as Ernest Erber. See Chapter 1. Quote, "Roland is Louis Jacobs. Quote, a comrade with great prestige in the Fourth International," end quote, is Natalia Sadova, Trotsky's widow. Quote, "Frank," end quote, is Bert Cochran. Alright, so here we go. The party and its political life are directed, we said, in 1939/40 by a clique led by canon which we characterize as bureaucratically conservative. The only amendment the new opposition, Morrison, Morrow, Bennett, was obliged to introduce into this characterization is that the party leadership is the carrier of the, quote, "germs of Stalinist degeneration," end quote. This is the latest balance sheet that the new opposition cast up after 5 years in which the leadership of the Socialist Workers' Party operated with a maximum of party unity, a maximum of collaboration from all party leadership, and a minimum of inter-party opposition, that is, none at all. Our second main criticism in the 1939 dispute may be paraphrased as follows, quote, "You have converted the theory that Russia is a workers' state and the slogan of the unconditional defense of Russia in war into abstractions which make it impossible for you to deal correctly with the concrete political problems of the class struggle. When you deal with them, they bring you to a reactionary position. You base your central strategy on the defense of the Stalinist regime, which is an integral part of the imperialist coalition in the war. We base ours on assembling, building, and leading to victory the, quote, third camp," end quote. The independent forces of the workers, peasants, and colonial peoples fighting for freedom against both imperialist camps. Our policy will make it possible for the revolutionary Marxists to come to the leadership of the inevitably upsurging movement of rebellion. Yours will make you the apologist of Stalinism, the tail to its kite," end quote. The Canaanites answered, as is their custom in such disputes, with a minimum of argument and a maximum of imprecation. Quote, "We reiterate our fundamental principles. We cling to our fundamental principles. We are for unconditional defense of the Soviet Union. You have capitulated in the war to the pressure of bourgeois democracy. You are petty bourgeois opponents of Marxism," end quote. Let us see how these, quote, "fundamental principles," end quote, have stood up in practice, and this is the only decisive test in the past few years, not in the light of our criticism, so much as in the light of the criticism of the new oppositionists who joined, alas, in the condemnation of us in 1939 and later. For this purpose, we have an invaluable document by A. Roland, Roland being Louis Jacobs, one second. Sorry, one second. Roland is Louis Jacobs. For this purpose, we have an invaluable document by A. Roland, significantly entitled, quote, "We arrive at a line," end quote. Roland is an old party member, and unlike Cannon and the court clique, knows something about Marxism. Remember, Roland is Louis Jacobs, so I'm going to start saying Louis Jacobs when it says Roland. Louis Jacobs was a stout defender of Trotsky's position in 1939. Louis Jacobs' criticism is all the more enlightening because of that. In the very first place, Roland shows again that all sophistry, muddle-headed argument, and, quote, "theory," end quote, to the contrary notwithstanding, it is impossible, in the Canaanite party to engage in a serious political dispute without coming into a head-on conflict with the party regime. Which always defends its prestige and position by the methods it knows best, the methods of bureaucratism. His indictment of this regime is more damning than anything we wrote and said about it 5 years ago. Now let us see what policy it is that this regime had to defend and see it the way it worked out in practice. It cannot be overemphasized that this is the decisive test. With the evidence assembled by Jacobs, let us apply the test to the, quote, Russian policy, end quote, of the Socialist Workers' Party. Jacobs' indictment on this score charges the leadership with hopeless confusion, hopeless inconsistency, inability to orient itself correctly or at all toward important events, painting up, apologizing for, and tail-ending Stalinism, and in general, woodenness of thought, unthinking paraphrasing of Trotsky, perversion of political line for considerations of bureaucratic prestige. For every charge, he adduces more than enough of the necessary proof. The Socialist Workers' Party line, boiled down to essentials, was simply this: repeated week in and week out. Russia is a worker state because the property in it is nationalized. In the war, the Stalinist bureaucracy is pursuing a role which is objectively revolutionary. Between Stalinist Russia and the capitalist world, there are antagonisms which are irreconcilable. It is the primary duty of every worker to defend Russia unconditionally. The lengths to which these absurd and reactionary dogmas were carried are given by Jacobs in some detail. Here is one example from the pen of one of the principal official spokesmen of the party, Wright, as set down in the April 1943 Fourth International. Quote, "But the same fundamental forces arising out of the irreconcilable clash between Soviet economy and world imperialism are driving the bureaucratic caste to measures which are revolutionary in their objective consequences, ... The Stalinist bureaucracy depends for its existence upon the maintenance of the worker state created by the October Revolution. In desperation and as a last resort, this bureaucracy has proved itself capable of acting in self-defense as to stimulate revolutionary developments, ... End quote. John G. Wright. If Stalinism is objectively revolutionary and has, quote, proved itself, end quote, able to stimulate revolutionary developments, the Marxian criticism of it ought to be reduced to fairly modest proportions. What else could a reader who has not been immunized against such reactionary nonsense conclude if he continued to read the Socialist Workers' Party press? He will learn there that the Stalinist bureaucracy is not only taking measures that are revolutionary in their objective consequences, but that at one time, quote, Stalin took preparatory steps for the Sovietization of Finland, end quote. This pitiable muddlehead of a Wright does not even know the difference between nationalization of industry and Sovietization, i.e. the means by which the proletariat establishes and consolidates its class power. To Wright, the appointment of slave drivers over industry by the GPU equals Sovietization, the proletarian revolution, and not only of Finland, Poland too. In the Militant of January 29, 1944, the same Wright had these unbelievable things to say about the program of Stalin's Quislings in Poland. Quote, ... The realization of this program would signify the complete destruction of Polish capitalism and a giant step in the inevitable extension of Soviet, bracket, again Soviet, exclamation point, end bracket, property forms far beyond the frontiers of 1939. In its turn, this carries a twofold threat to capitalism. First, in addition to strengthening the USSR immeasurably, it would greatly hamper further attempts to isolate it. Second, the revolutionary wave in Europe, especially in Germany, would receive so mighty an impulsion from such developments in the territories of former Poland, let alone Silesia, East Prussia, etc., that the attempt to drown the coming European revolution in blood would be rendered well nigh impossible, end quote. After this, nothing remains of the revolutionary struggle against Stalinism except to demand that it, ... carry out its program. Except to demand that it carry out its program. Nothing more than this is required to destroy capitalism in Poland and Eastern Germany. That is a mere beginning. By extending, quote, Soviet property to these lands, and then to give the proletarian revolution all over Europe such an impulsion as would practically guarantee its victory. The Stalinist bureaucracy, the GPU factory bosses, and the Azubka Moravsky are not the only guarantees of the victory of the European proletariat. There is also the Stalinist army. Trotsky called it the military arm of the Bonapartist counter-revolution. Wright, however, uninhibited by Trotsky's modesty and other qualities, has a different name for it. In a 1941 article, Wright wrote, quote, "It is not Stalin's Red Army that has successfully resisted the first two Nazi offensives. It is the Red Army of the October Revolution. It is Trotsky's Red Army, which was built in the fire of the Civil War, built not from the wreckage of the old Tsarist armies, but completely anew, unlike any other army in history, ... The Kremlin is, of course, trying to usurp credit for the heroic resistance of the Red Army, but Stalin will not succeed in this. We Trotskyists, Wright, it seems, calls himself a Trotskyist after all this, link up the present heroic resistance of the Red soldiers directly with the Russian October and the Civil War, ... Terrible as were the blows dealt by Stalin to the Red Army, it remains the one institution least affected, like 5 exclamation points, by his degenerated regime, end quote. From this political delirium should follow, should it not, a clarion call to the workers throughout Europe, quote, "Proletarians, welcome Trotsky's Red Army, welcome the liberators of the toiling peoples, welcome the heroic stormtroop divisions of the GPU, who are directly linked with the Red October," end quote. What has been quoted is not an individual aberration, although that is a contributing element in this case. It is the product of a political line. We have in addition also quoted by Jacobs the case of E.R. Frank. Frank being who's Frank? Bert Cochran. We have in addition also quoted by Rowland the case of Cochran. Cochran is another of the party bureaucrats who has recently decided to turn a deft hand to, quote, theoretical questions, unquote, under the impression that a snarl, pugnacious ignorance, and phrase-mongering are ample qualification. Howie demands in an article on December 4th, 1943, quote, "How is anybody going to explain today that amazing unity of Soviet peoples, that unprecedented vitality and morale which exists throughout the Red Army and the peoples of the Soviet Union, except on the theory of the October Revolution, though stifled and degraded, still lives, ... end quote." Cochran. Louis Jacobs' comment on this panegyric to Stalinism is to the point, quote, "The complete unity of the Soviet peoples under the totalitarian regime of Stalin. How could one possibly call for political revolution in that case? The unity of the Soviet peoples amidst the growth of inequality and an almost complete indifference of the bureaucracy to the lot and fate of the people during the war. The unity of the Soviet peoples, and the imprisonment even during the war not of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, but of millions in the concentration camps of the Kremlin. Could Stalin have wished for better propaganda in his favor? Stalin could have pointed to our press and asked what further proof was necessary that his killing off of all the oppositionists had united and strengthened the USSR," end quote. Louis Jacobs. We thereby get a very accurate definition of a, quote, "official Trotskyist," end quote, i.e. a Canaanite. He is a miserable epigon of Trotsky who cannot speak on Russia without carrying on, among revolutionary workers, better propaganda for Stalin than Stalin himself could hope for. And by combining Wright and Frank, we get the following definition of Stalinist Russia. Frank again being Cochran. It is a country which is despotically oppressed by a totalitarian counter-revolutionary Bonapartist autocracy that has converted the country as a whole into a prison for the people and is based upon Soviet property and amazing unity of the Soviet peoples and Trotsky's Red Army, all of which it employs to take objectively revolutionary measures that stimulate the world revolution, thus making Russia a worker state which is an irreconcilable antagonism to the imperialist world that is allied with it, gives it aid and comfort, and material and even political support in return for material and political support received. For the length of this definition, we are ready to take our share of responsibility. For its insanity, we share no responsibility and accept none. The reader may think, after all, it is only Wright, or only Cochrane, who is involved. If he is an informed reader, he may add, and after all, who is forced to take them seriously as the spokesman of the Socialist Workers' Party? There is some validity to such reflections. What is wrong and misleading about them is shown by 3 facts. 1. That their statements appear as the official view of the Socialist Workers' Party, that they are not rebuked or repudiated in any way by the party leadership, but were and are still being defended by the party leadership. And 3. That the boss of the party himself is of a piece with them. To prove the last assertion, we refer once more to Louis Jacobs' precious document. Following page after page of evidence on the reactionary character of the official party policy on Russia, coupled with as much evidence on the preposterous vacillation and somersaults of the party press from week to week and month to month, he arrives at the period of the Warsaw Uprising of last August. Under pressure of the stirring event and of Roland himself, the Socialist Workers' Party Committee made another somersault in policy. It came out in favor of the Warsaw Uprising, ranged itself with the revolutionists, warned them against Stalinist perfidy and counter-revolution, and called, among other things, for fraternization with the Russian army, so to help the Russian people, quote, settle accounts with the bloody Bonapartist dictatorship of Stalin, end quote. Those of us who read the editorial in the Militant of August 19, 1944, recall with some satisfaction the policy presented in it. We recall also that it followed from the inspiring action of the Warsaw proletariat, and in no way whatsoever from anything in the analysis and policies defended up to then by the Canaanites. The piece isn't over yet, but if nothing is mentioned of the Jewish character of the Warsaw Uprising, that kind of speaks to a certain blindness to questions of anti-Semitism in the left generally. In my opinion at least, that's my opinion. Take it for what you will. The party boss who is not at hand when the editorial appeared reacted promptly for a change. His letter of protest against the editorial is a monstrosity, but such a revealing one that we reprint it in its entirety thanks to Roland. Again, Roland being Louis Jacobs, who did likewise in order to thwart the party bureaucracy's attempt to conceal it from the membership. Quote, the August 19th Militant editorial, Warsaw Betrayed, goes even further afield than the previous editorial we wrote about in muddling up our line of, quote, unconditional defense of the Soviet Union, end quote, in the struggle against the Nazi imperialist invaders, to call upon the revolutionary Polish workers to, quote, organize fraternization, end quote, with the Red Army soldiers, as the editorial does, is to think in terms of establishing contact with the rank and file of a hostile military force. But the Polish workers must be the allies of the Red Army in its war against Hitler's armies, no matter how reactionary Stalin's policy is. But the Polish workers must be the allies of the Red Army in its war against Hitler's armies, no matter how reactionary Stalin's policy is. Therefore, the task for the Polish revolutionaries is to organize revolutionary propaganda in the ranks of the Red Army, which they will be in contact as allies, not to, quote, organize fraternization, end quote. Secondly, the editorial adds that through this, quote, fraternization, end quote, the Polish workers will help the Soviet masses to, quote, settle accounts with the bloody Bonapartist dictatorship of Stalin, end quote. Our program recognizes the vital necessity of overthrowing Stalinism in the Soviet Union and has always placed this task in order of importance, second only to the defense of the Soviet Union against imperialist attacks. However, it is precisely the latter consideration that the editorial slurs over. Finally, the editorial again fails to put explicitly and unmistakably our slogan, quote, unconditional defense of the Soviet Union, end quote, against all imperialists. The editorial also takes for granted a version of the Warsaw events about which there is little information, none of it reliable, and many uncertainties. A full-scale battle against the Nazis by the Warsaw proletariat is assumed, as is the quote order of Stalin's generals, end quote, in halting the Red Army attack on the city. The Moscow charge that the London, quote, Polish government in exile, end quote, ordered the uprising without consulting the Red Army, command is brushed aside without being clearly stated, much less analyzed in the light of the current Soviet-Polish negotiations. No consideration is given to the question of whether or not the Red Army was able at the moment to launch an all-out attack on Warsaw in view of its long-sustained offensive, the Nazi defensive preparations along the Vistula, the necessity to regroup forces en masse for new attacks after the not inconsiderable expenditure of men and material in reaching the outskirts of Warsaw, the fact that there was a lull along virtually the entire Eastern Front concurrent with the halt before Warsaw, etc. Nor does the editorial take up the question of the duty of guerrilla forces, and in the circumstances that is what the Warsaw detachments are, to subordinate themselves to the high command of the main army, the Red Army. I'm going to repeat that because it's in italics. Nor does the editorial take up the question of the duty of guerrilla forces, and in the circumstances that is what the Warsaw detachments are, to subordinate themselves to the high command of the main army, the Red Army, in timing such an important battle at the siege of Warsaw. On the contrary, the editorial appears to take as its point of departure the assumption that a full-scale proletarian uprising occurred in Warsaw and that Stalin deliberately maneuvered to permit Hitler to crush the revolt. I'm not sure, I'm not an expert on the Warsaw Uprising, but I think this is generally considered to be true. That is considered to be true. A hasty, sketchy commentary on events, including the badly limping Badoglio analogy, is then fitted into this arbitrary framework. We agree, indeed, as to Stalin's counter-revolutionary intentions. Moreover, one has the right to suspect or believe personally that the Warsaw events are, just as the editorial pictures them. But we have no right to put in writing in our press, and in an editorial to boot, such sweeping assertions for which we have no proof, and to draw conclusions based on such flimsy information. That is not the tradition of the militant. We are deeply concerned about this carelessness in writing about such a crucial question, and are anxious to hear the comments on our criticism." End quote. Let us not dwell on the style. It is as unnecessary as it is disagreeable. In any case, the political line is infinitely more important. The Warsaw proletariat was climaxing 5 years of unremitting struggle against the national and class oppressor, with an epic effort. The Stalin regime was preparing to stab in the back, not only with cynicism and cold-bloodedness, but above all with such obviousness as to move even the editors of the Militant away from this false line and toward a correct one. By defending the antithesis of what they had defended, they leaped over their own heads and did their revolutionary duty. If, as the party boss said, they went, quote, further afield, in muddling up our line of, quote, unconditional defense of the Soviet Union, end quote, it was because the line was radically false. But in, quote, muddling, end quote, it further, they at least made one progressive contribution amidst the 100 reactionary ones they had made in the past. What did the party boss contribute? Instructions to the effect that the militant should advise the Warsaw proletariat, contemptuously referred to as guerrilla forces. Stalin's army of counter-revolution is Trotsky's Red Army, but the insurrectionary Warsaw workers are ... mere guerrillas. To, quote, subordinate themselves to the high command of the main army, the Red Army, end quote. Or to translate the pompous pseudo-military wisdom, the Warsaw workers must submit to the executioners of the GPU. In what name? In the name of, quote, unconditional defense of the Soviet Union, end quote. Not even the Stalinists dared to carry out the crushing of the Polish proletariat under such a banner. The boss of the Socialist Workers' Party deserves to be remembered, if only for the fact that he was the one person in the whole wide world who called upon the Warsaw workers to, quote, subordinate themselves, end quote, to their hangman, Stalin, quote, the high command of the main army, end quote. There is the fruit, in practice, of the, quote, defense of the Soviet Union, end quote. There is the fruit, in practice, of the, quote, defense of the Soviet Union, end quote. The sequel to this letter is as revealing as the letter itself. At about the same time that it was written, another letter was being written and unknown to the party boss transmitted to the Socialist Workers' Party leadership. It came from a comrade with great prestige in the Fourth International, a comrade whose opinions cannot be so easily dismissed by the Canaanites with personal aspersions, dirty gossip, or imprecations, Be it noted that we write, quote, cannot be so easily dismissed, end quote. Cannot be so easily dismissed, end quote. It, too, is worth reprinting in its entirety. Quote, I do not consider myself competent in political questions to the extent of condemning this or that line of your conduct, but in the given instance, your mistaken course is all too clear to me. Permit me a few words in this connection. You seem to be hypnotized by the slogan of the, quote, defense of the USSR, end quote, and in the meantime, profound changes, political as well as moral psychological, have taken place in its social structure. In its social structure. In his articles, especially the last ones, L.D., Leon Trotsky, wrote of the USSR as a degenerating worker state, and in view of this outlined two possible paths of further social evolution of the first worker state, revolutionary and reactionary. The last 4 years have shown us that the reactionary landslide has assumed monstrous proportions within the USSR. I shall not recount the facts. They are known to you. They bespeak of the complete moving away of the USSR from the principles of October. Soviet literature for the war years, Moscow magazines which I am receiving, confirm these facts. In current Moscow literature there is not the slightest echo of socialist ideology. Dominant in it are petty bourgeois, middle-class tendencies, the call to the family and its welfare. The Red Army, at the basis of whose organization were lodged the principles of the October overturn, and whose, the Red Army's, goal was the struggle for the world revolution, has become transformed into a nationalist, patriotic organization defending the fatherland, and not against its bureaucratic regime, but together with its regime, as it has taken shape in the last decade. Do you recall the answer of Leon Trotsky to the question put to him in the Politburo in 1927, whether the opposition would defend the USSR in case of war? Quote, the socialist fatherland, yes. Stalin's regime, no. End quote. Excuse me. This is a continuation of the quote. The, quote, socialist, end quote, has fallen away. The, quote, regime, end quote, has remained. A degenerating, quote, worker state, end quote, presupposes that it is moving along the path of degeneration, still preserving its basic principle, the nationalization of private property. But just as it is impossible to build socialism in one country, so it is impossible to preserve inviolate this basic principle if one pursues the reactionary road, destroying all the other conquests of 1917. It is necessary to explain this tirelessly day by day. It is impermissible to repeat an antiquated slogan by rote. At the present time, there is only one danger threatening the Soviet Union, that is the further development of black reaction, the further betrayal of the international proletariat. This is precisely the direction in which it is necessary to sound the alarm. To defend the Soviet Union against the regime of its, quote, master, end quote, mercilessly laying bare the policy of the master who comes to the fore on the international arena in the capacity of a conciliator with bourgeois capitalism and as a counter-revolutionist in the European countries liberated from Hitler. As far back as 1937, L.D. wrote in the bulletin of the Russian opposition that not a single serious person believes any longer in the revolutionary role of Stalin. You are correctly criticizing the foreign policy of the Marshal, but after all, foreign policy is the continuation of the domestic policy. It is impermissible to separate the one from the other. In your position there is a crying contradiction. It is necessary to hammer away at one point, to warn against the consequences of Russian victories, to sound the alarm on the basis of the elements that have already been disclosed with complete clarity, as well as to lay bare those elements which are about to be disclosed, and at the same time point the way out. End quote. This letter, which is blow upon blow at point after point of the Socialist Workers' Party position, I want to see He said in the beginning there was something about Natalia Trotsky. I think that quote might have been from her. Yeah, that last bit was Natalia Sadova Trotsky, Trotsky's widow. This letter, which is blow upon blow at point after point of the Socialist Workers' Party position, as Louis Jacobs points out, caused a sensation and complete consternation among the Socialist Workers' Party leadership. The first reaction, how to conceal it from the membership, and not only from the membership, but even from those leading members, like Morrow and Morrison, who were in opposition. Their second reaction, how to maintain the prestige of the party leadership, and above all of the party boss, who had just written in the directly opposite sense. Thanks in large measure to Louis Jacobs, Thanks in large measure to Louis Jacobs, the leadership succeeded in neither case. It was not for want of trying. The letter just quoted was promptly communicated to the party boss. With an agility nowhere revealed in his first letter, he prepared a retreat. He wrote a new letter to the committee which proposed, in effect, a change of policy on Russia, accompanied by all kinds of transparent, quote, subtleties, end quote, to prove that it was not, after all, a change in policy. Like this previous letter which said the opposite, it was couched in his customary statesman tone, and intended for proclamation to the entire party membership. It prudently omitted any reference whatsoever to his original letter, with which it did not jibe, and b. any reference whatsoever to the letter we have quoted, which criticized the Socialist Workers' Party line and urged a change in it. If any change is to be made in the party line, only one man may initiate it, at least so far as the membership knows. What had changed in the world situation? What had changed in the situation in Russia? For the boss, nothing. All that had changed was that someone with prestige and authority that cannot easily be torn down in the movement had proposed a change. In the Socialist Workers' Party leadership, where, as Louis Jacobs says, a, quote, completely hierarchic attitude, end quote, reigns, it is not freely expressed critical thought, not the unhampered exchange of views, not objective considerations, but, quote, authority, end quote, and prestige considerations that decide policy. There and there alone lies the secret of the recent, essentially meaningless, quote, change, end quote, in the Socialist Workers' Party policy on Russia. To the complete surprise and dumbfoundment of the membership, without their having been prepared for it in the slightest degree, just the opposite. The party leadership solemnly announced that the slogan of, quote, unconditional defense of the Soviet Union, end quote, has been subjected to a, quote, shift in emphasis, end quote. How delicately put. What refinement. Now you see, due to the, quote, shift in objective conditions, end quote. Translation. The shift in emphasis recommended by the influential comrade and the need of preserving bureaucratic prestige. The old slogan is no longer, quote, in the fore, end quote. It is, quote, retired, end quote, to a secondary place. Nothing wrong with it, mind you, only it doesn't have the very, very first place now. In its place, quote, we therefore push to the fore and emphasize today that section of our program embodying the slogan, defense of the European Revolution against all its enemies. Defense of the European Revolution coincides with the genuine revolutionary defense of the USSR, end quote. Socialist Workers' Party Convention Resolution. Apparently, before today, the defense of the European Revolution did not coincide with the, quote, genuine revolutionary defense of the USSR, end quote, but from today onward it does. That is, now that the Canaanites have contributed their tiny mite to helping Stalinist Russia grow stronger against the European Revolution, Warsaw worker, subordinate yourselves to the Marshal. It is obviously high time to defend that revolution. No open correction of errors, no honest explanation of changes and turns. Politics as an instrument of organization instead of organization as an instrument of politics. That is how the Canaanites rule and ruin the Socialist Workers' Party. It is not necessary to emphasize that the political education of the membership is utterly impossible under such conditions. This is not to say necessarily that it is also impossible to increase the membership of such a party. It is possible, but it will not be a revolutionary party that deserves the name of Trotsky. It is not by accident that Louis Jacobs tells of what the, quote, authoritative, end quote, comrade wrote in another letter to the Socialist Workers' Party. The letter says, Louis Jacobs, quote, ... reminded them, please tell us in what connection Comrade Stein, and of an incident way back in 1927 in which the old man and a Stalinist bureaucrat were involved. The old man was criticizing the Stalinists in the executive committee. One of them asked, quote, where is the party, end quote, and Trotsky replied, quote, you have strangled the party, end quote. Idle reminiscence? No. The comrade is making a timely, pointed, and in its nature a deadly reference to what is happening to the Socialist Workers' Party under the Canaanite regime, which Morrison, who is Morrison again? Albert Goldman, rightly called the bearer of the virus of Stalinism. The future of the Socialist Workers' Party as a revolutionary organization is at best a dubious one. We recognized that 5 years ago. What has happened since has only made this fact plainer and caused many others to realize it. The number of those who understood this can only increase. The end. Thank you for listening.